Thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening for this very exciting Good Web Network event. I'm Ellen, I'm the head of CHASM, which is our digital research hub here at Demos. And we focus on how we can make the internet more democratic, more inclusive, more promoting human rights. And we're really excited to be partnering for this event with the Good Things Foundation to focus on how we can be making the good web and this democratic vision of the web accessible to everybody. And the Good Things Foundation are our first founding partner on the network. So we're really very glad to have them here tonight. They deliver the National Data Bank, a National Device Bank, and digital skills support. And I think there are a few of them around, so do make sure to catch them afterwards if you have questions about any of that. And what we really want to talk about this evening is we have this broad consensus, it seems, that digital inclusion is a good thing. You know, it's in the name. But yet we don't really seem to be making much progress on it. Things seem to be kind of stalled. So we want to explore kind of what can be done, what needs to change, what are the barriers, and how can we overcome them. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. If they're in the case of a fire, their fire exit is to the back and to the right. A hello to our online audience. I think we have quite a big online audience this evening. So please do submit questions online, and one of our excellent researchers will be reading them out. And yes, we will be going around with questions later on as well. A quick note to speakers and audience, if you could speak into a mic for the benefit of the online audience. But without further ado, I would really excited to be welcoming our speakers this evening. So we have Chi Onwurah MP, who is the Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Innovation and the MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central. We have Dr. Emma Stone, who is the Director of Evidence and Engagement at Good Things Foundation and co-investigator on the Minimum Digital Living Standards project. And we have Sade Nathaniel Ayodele, the Data Poverty Lab Fellow and Technology Program Manager at Southwark Council, who is launching her report this evening that she has been working on for the Data Poverty Lab on internet access as an essential utility or a human right. And you can access that report on the Good Things Foundation website right now. So I would love to kick off with one sentence reflection from each of our speakers to get things going. So our question to start off with is, what would be the one thing you would want to see done to improve access to digital infrastructure? And I'm going to start with Sade.
Thank you. I guess the one thing I would like to see is support from central government, and that includes funding from central government as well. We currently do not have a digital inclusion strategy. So next year, 2024, will mark 10 years since the digital inclusion strategy. So bring a cake in case we don't have one then. But definitely want to see dedicated funding, ring-fenced digital inclusion funding to support infrastructure rollout needs, digital inclusion needs, and access to devices.
So my one thing is to reframe the question a bit and say yes to the digital infrastructure, but we really, really need to make sure that the community organisations, the libraries, the family hubs, the small groups, the housing associations, the local authority teams, who are absolutely essential to supporting use of the internet in communities, that they are recognised and valued and resourced. And for me, and for Good Things, that is the social infrastructure. We need a social infrastructure as well as the digital infrastructure, because otherwise, you know, all of that kind of amazing full fibre is just not going to enrich and enhance our lives. Chi.
Thanks very much, and yes to all of that. In a way. But yeah, the one thing I would focus on, I would do, and obviously building out more digital infrastructure is really important. But raising digital literacy is absolutely key, because we want access to digital infrastructure, but we want informed and empowered access. And digital literacy should be about making the internet work for people and not people for the internet.
So thank you so much, everyone. We've got funding from central government, we've got community organisation support and raising digital literacy. And please be thinking about your own answers to the questions, because I'm going to be picking on some of you later to answer it too. But Chi, I'd love to come back to you first to hear more about your views on digital inclusion, what it means to you, the work you've done, some of the challenges you face from a policy-making perspective, and how digital inclusion is manifesting in the lives of your constituents.
Fantastic. You said I had 5 minutes. Yes, is that right? So my background is as an electrical engineer, and I worked in technology, building the networks which now form the internet for over 20 years in the UK and France and the US and in Africa and Singapore and places. And so what that gave me, and I'm very proud of that work, and I consider myself a technology evangelist, but I'm also very saddened, if you like, that the internet that I was building out, the technology that was supposed to bring people together and empower people, is seen by my constituents now as something which is oppressive often, which is surveilling them, which is exploiting them, which they are forced to use in order to access basic public services and indeed benefits. And so for me and for the Labour Party, and one of our key industrial strategy missions, and I recommend you have a look at that, is data for the public good. For the Labour Party, the internet, the web, that fantastic technologies which can empower and enrich all our lives, have to be centered around users. And the internet should be a right, not a privilege. So ensuring that access is a right and not a privilege means providing people with the skills, the confidence to use the internet, as well as the infrastructure, necessary infrastructure that ensures that no one is priced out of important digital products and services. And it means reframing or readdressing the power imbalance, so that it is the people who have the power and not tech giants. And just let me say, tech giants have done wonderful things in pushing out products and services, but we have to ensure that that people that they are not driving the internet. I always say, that technology is neither right nor wrong, but it's not something that happens to us. It is something that is the social impact specifically of technology, is something that is shaped by governments. And too often, we hear people say, "Oh, technology is moving so fast, government can't keep up. No point in having regulation because it's always going to be backward looking." That's not true. This is not rocket science. This is literally not rocket science. And in fact, all of the harms that we are now experiencing through the internet were predicted. I mean, I know because I predicted them. I worked for Ofcom at the time, the regulator, before coming into Parliament. So what we need is enlightened, forward-looking regulation. What we need is access to the internet. And so just some of the policies that we are promoting to ensure access is to look at the internet web as the newest utility. So to have a social tariff for broadband access, just as you do for energy, though those are far too high at the moment now, to ensure that to prompt Ofcom to be more proactive in taking action to strengthen consumer protection, including on internet usage and on tariffs, to ensure that the pricing of broadband, even the non-social tariff broadband, for example, is properly regulated, to increase competition. I mean, we've gone from having one of the most competitive broadband markets in the world to having one of the most sort of consolidated broadband markets, and a huge consolidation in platforms and apps. And as part and sort of alongside that, raising digital literacy. It's ensuring, and we saw this during COVID, the children who could not keep up with their studies, the disparity between those who in private schools, for example, who had access to devices, and those in, like a constituent of mine, 5 children trying to share one tablet 24 hours a day. So ensuring that we raise digital literacy, and that's all about sort of part of our education system, improving and supporting opportunity in education. I'm going to stop now because I could go on forever, and you wouldn't like that.
I'd love to stay with you just for a minute.
Okay.
Just to wanted to follow up and ask, I guess, what you see as the biggest barrier to achieving this. What's the thing we really have to overcome if we're going to crack this?
Well, I mean, just it's not it's not there isn't one barrier. I mean, right now in the cost of living crisis, when people can't afford to pay their energy bills, being able to pay your broadband bill, never mind ensuring that your kids or your partners or yourself have the right kind of digital access skills, that's a real challenge. So I think what is the biggest barrier is normalizing digital literacy and digital access, and that's about culture. It is about pricing, which is some of the things we have specific policies on, and it's about it's about making that we are all digital citizens, and we all need to be taking part in the sort of digital economy and the digital society.
Thank you. I'd love to get a couple of questions or comments from the audience at this stage. We're going to pass this mic around. I would ask people to wait to speak until you have the mic and just give you a quick introduction. We have two in the black jacket and then in the yellow jumper.
Hi, my name is Rich Stanky. I am the MD of an organization called Jangala. And yeah, we are a not-for-profit technology company. We've been providing internet access technologies for developing world contexts, for development, but also during the pandemic, we've been working in the UK to connect exactly those families that she was talking about. And I'm formerly of Ofcom as well. So but that was in my past life as an economist. But I've got a really short point I wanted to make, which, I think Emma's kind of touched on this already, which is the idea of, we talk about digital poverty, but what's the idea of kind of digital wealth? What would an abundance look like? Because connecting to the internet is just one gateway to a whole range of services. But the world is bigger than that now. We have things like 3D printing, AR, VR, other things that people can use in association with the internet to create things, to make. It's, in a sense, libraries were founded to make these expensive things available to all. So, as the panel discusses, as the discussion progresses, it would be really good to get some kind of feeling on that. So, how do we be ambitious in this area rather than just saying, well, here's the kind of minimum level, which, might be suitable now, but may not, maybe, be very kind of poor and thin in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm Ellen Helsper. I'm a professor in social digital inequalities at the London School of Economics, just down the road. And my question is a bit like a follow-up on that, also in terms of accountability, because we've been saying these things. It's not the first time that we've been saying it, but there seems, as was said before, that somehow we keep talking about it and doing things, but seems to be a little bit of an issue in terms of saying, like, not just now, who should be doing this, but also who will be held accountable if it doesn't happen in the future, which is a differently digital future maybe than the one we're living in right now. So I think that vision of what would wealth look like, what would really allow somebody not just to be able to get along now or catch up, but really to be, included and feel included and be included in the future. But so how are we equipping? What are we talking about? And who will be held accountable if it doesn't happen?
I mean, those are two fantastic points, and I think. So I think when I was talking about that, digital literacy is not about simply being able to use the internet or to use the web, but it is being able to create it, to create on it, and to be empowered by it. And so, if we talk about, I suppose, what does Labour want for what's our mission? It is, the highest growth in the G7, the high scale, high wage, high productivity economy. But that has to be about citizens being empowered to define, if you like, their own level, their own sense of well-being, and to achieve it. And so, digital and access to broadband and skills is a tool to achieve that. And so what would one of the things that I would like to say is that everybody felt in control of their digital experience, in control of their digital lives, in control of their data, and was using that to optimize their own sense of well-being. And in terms of accountability, it is government who's accountable. And I've the point about not having had a digital inclusion strategy since 2014. I will be raising that regularly in Parliament. It hasn't, didn't get much traction, unfortunately. but I can tell you that, over the last 10 years, there should have been so much more done to achieve a regulatory environment which empowered people, and which also empowered small businesses, companies to offer different types. I'm not going to predict what they might have done, but a more level playing field when it came to data, and a better access to broadband digital resources for small businesses and for individuals, as well as proper infrastructure access for schools. There's so much that could have been done, not at cost. It's about the regulatory environment and ensuring better distribution of the existing digital resources.
Thank you so much. And Sade, I'd love to come to you now. We've heard she talked a bit about rights and utilities, and we've had some questions around what would digital wealth then look like. I personally, to declare an interest, I'm very passionate about human rights, and so this is a topic of particular interest to me, and it's part of our mission at Chasm to be advocating for an internet that promotes human rights. So I'd love to pass to you to hear, is the internet a human right? Is it a utility? What's the answer?
I think this was the most tricky part of my fellowship, because I kept on umming and ahhing, saying, oh, it's a human right because X, Y, and Z, and it's an essential utility because of these reasons. And I think what happened during the process, I came to the conclusion that it's both. It's regulated as an essential utility, so similar to gas, water, and electricity, but it's a utility like no other. So it's not a natural monopoly, although, I mean, it does have kind of some similarities with gas, water, and electricity in that there are social tariffs, although from a broadband point of view, it's voluntary compared to water, which is mandatory. It's kind of from a human rights point of view, I'm going to take you through a brief history lesson. So back in 1948, we had the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and I'm taking you through this process so you can see why it's a human right and why it's so essential. And then in 1953, we had the European Convention of Human Rights. Followed by that, the UK then kind of had all of that brought together into the UK Human Rights Act in 1998. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because there are a lot of key years, but in 2015, we had the United Nations 2030 Agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 1 talks about having no poverty, or kind of tackling poverty everywhere. Goal number 4 talks about quality education. And to be honest, most of these Sustainable Development Goals have kind of technology as kind of the foundation. It's an enabler for a lot of those Sustainable Development Goals. But when we speak about the United Nations SDGs, of which the UK is a signatory, I think about the fact that tackling poverty should also include tackling data poverty. And when we talk about quality education, like Chi spoke about, we should be thinking about a computer curriculum that's fit for the future. So when you talk about digital wealth, thinking about our young kids of today and how we can kind of get them ready for the future, how we can kind of have unicorns, I guess, of tomorrow. So in some ways, it's a human right because it allows us to basically fulfill so many of the rights. So the right to leisure, the right to freedom of expression. You think about Twitter as a public square. It then becomes a bit tricky when you talk about internet access as a human right, because sometimes when you speak to people, they automatically think a human right means that it should be free. So it should be free for all. I personally believe that it should be free in certain situations. So if you're vulnerable, if you are on low income, the internet access should be free. But then you start to ask and answer a few other questions, which are at what level should the internet access be free? So should it be 10 megabits per second, which is the universal service obligation from Ofcom? I don't believe that's sufficient. Emma's going to speak about that. She also doesn't believe it's sufficient. And then you think about things like the right to assembly, and the fact that so many things we do are online. We all know how the pandemic impacted so many of us. Within the lockdowns, a lot of elderly people, that was the only way they could kind of communicate. So they kind of had Skype, they had WhatsApp, they had Teams, we all had Zoom fatigue. And you start to realize that we cannot live without the internet. I mean, I can put it to you to try and go one day without your phone or without any internet access and see how long you last. So in some ways, it is a human right. And then when we talk about internet access as a utility, it's regulated as a utility because in order to kind of facilitate the rollout of fiber infrastructure, you need a wayleave agreement similar to water, gas, and electricity. So, I mean, I went back and forth, and then I kind of fell in the middle. It's both. And there were a number of recommendations that I put forward in terms of kind of going either way and kind of meshing the two together. So one of the key recommendations was around internet access as a human right, but putting forward the panel framework. So the panel framework is a rights-based approach, and it talks about participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality, empowerment and legality. And within the panel framework, there are things like, so for instance, in terms of participation, making sure that we're putting people with lived experience of data poverty or digital exclusion at the center of anything we do. So there was a project that happened with Lottie where they kind of identified about 20 different digital exclusion user groups. So things like that, making sure that you're thinking about them when whatever projects you do. I also spoke about digital exclusion multipliers, so things that make things worse. So we've had a decade plus of austerity. These are things, so the cost of living crisis, these are things that make the situation much more worse. Panel. Empowerment. So empowerment deals with kind of ensuring that residents or even local authorities have the right remedies and they know what they're entitled to. They know how they can, I guess, fight the system. So the universal service obligation, you're entitled to 10 megabits per second. Whether or not that's fit for purpose, that's kind of by the way, but you are entitled to that. You're entitled to automatic compensation. As a local authority, we also have the Social Value Act. So when we are negotiating these wayleave agreements, one of the things you can do as a local authority is to try and get the providers to provide more than just infrastructure on the road. It could include free connections to assets of social value. So your libraries, your community centers, your sheltered housing. It could include access to devices. And then I also believe that it's not just the responsibility of kind of central government, even though that was one of my recommendations. It's also, as Emma said, the responsibility of kind of local authorities, like your community organizations. It's the responsibility of you and I as a person, because you can choose to volunteer your hours and help your neighbor that's in need. You can choose to recycle your devices and participate in the circular economy. So those were some of the recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them because you have to read it. But those are some of the recommendations I put forward.
Thank you so much. And I think absolutely recommend reading the report. And one of the things I really loved about it was how you draw out on these conceptual framings, but the way that we conceptualize these issues and the way that we think about these issues really translates into how we think about what the policy solutions should be. I guess a quick follow-up question before I come back to the audience for some more thoughts would be sort of what do you see as being the thing that needs to happen next? What would you hope policymakers can take away from the report as the thing they need to do next in the stage to bring about some of these recommendations?
I think my point around putting people with lived experience of data poverty at the center of things is key. Part of my fellowship involved speaking to the Apple Collective. So the Apple Collective it stands for addressing poverty with lived experience. And I attended a session that they ran, and I got to hear from actual people that are kind of in the thick of it. And they spoke about how internet access is a human right, it's an essential utility. Some of them said, or one person said they would die if they didn't have the internet because they have their access to kind of public health information and everything else on there. Their children kind of need the internet access to kind of participate in education. So definitely involving them and having, Chi spoke about the fact that it seems like people lose their agency because everything is kind of you're forced online. I think having people in the room that have experienced that does go a long way in kind of making sure that the policy recommendations actually are being done in support with people rather than to them.
Thank you. Absolutely, and I think we did some research during the pandemic, and one of the things that really came out was people's experiences, people who had access to internet saying, it's so, it's great. I've been able to Zoom my family and keep in touch with my friends, and it's not so bad. And people without access saying it's just a nightmare. I can't access education. I can't access essential services. Can't get shopping. Audience, would love to come to you for another couple of questions and/or comments. Again, we have a roving mic. One in the front row in the blue jacket.
Hi, Chris from Nominet. My question: I've had the privilege of reading Sade's report already, and it is absolutely brilliant. So anybody who does get a chance to read it, it's fantastic. My question is building on what Chi and Sade said about the lack of policy for the last decade. Have we got this to the stage now in the policy vacuum, or are we just desperate in the digital inclusion community that any policy or legislation will do? Is it time for government to move fast and break things?
Let's come in on that.
Well, I don't. The government spent the online harms bill, which is still going through Parliament, has been. It started as round tables, I think, in 2015 when there was demand for. So I think it's certainly time to move fast. But there's been so much analysis and consultation and whatever that there shouldn't be breaking things because the challenges are very much identified. And I think to your point, we have speaking as a Labour MP here, we have to do what we can, if you like, and we're holding the government to account and also trying to get through the minimum we can. And there's parts of the online harms bill which are good. For example, I'm taking that example because that's all that we've got. They've got the digital protection bill as well. But yeah, a Labour government will have to build on what we have. But the issue here is that successive Conservative governments have basically not believed that the state can do anything for good in this space, or have not wanted to believe that. And so they've denuded the state, whether it be Ofcom, whether it be the department, whether it be regulatory authorities, of the powers and the resources to address these challenges. These challenges are addressable, but we have the successive Conservative governments have chosen not to address it, to leave it to the market, and that is why we are where we are now.
I think we need to operate on many levels here. I think there are absolutely recommendations, concrete actions, many of which are identified in Sade's report. Things like we have a universal service obligation already. It's 5 years out of date. That can be reviewed. We don't need massive legislation for the Secretary of State to say, I want to review it and I want to get Ofcom's advice on what that should be. So there are definitely things we can do. I think to the point that we've all made as well, that's been made around the future, we also need bolder, bigger thinking. Let's really try not to break people in the process, but there is absolutely an important space for that. And I think I want to make two other reflections. One is that it feels to me as though the lag here is in a lack of direction from central government and in terms of central government policy, because in the devolved nations, Scottish government has a digital inclusion strategy, so does the Welsh government. At a regional level, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, West Mid, so this isn't a party political point, there are public leaders taking bold steps forward, and we have leadership at every level, including in communities. So for me, there is a piece about central government. The strategy point has been made, taking responsibility, and also I'm going to bring in the LGA's recent recommendation, which was around this needs to be across different government departments. Yeah. This isn't about just Department for Work and Pensions, HMRC, Department of Health and Social Care, drawing circles around themselves. This has to be coordinated. And I think that lack of coordination and joined up thinking and that lack of leadership is breaking people.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Any other questions at this point from the audience? Apart from someone trying to get in the door. Fab. Well, Emma, I'd love to come back to you and hear a bit more about, obviously, your work on the Minimum Digital Living Standards Project, which got a couple of shout outs in this week's evidence session at the Lords Committee, which, conflict of interest again, I was there, I shouted it out. But would love to hear more about what you found in your research as to what digital inclusion really means for people, because I think often there's a perception that it's kind of just having access to a phone and that's kind of it. So
brilliant.
I'd love to hear from you on
Brilliant.
the findings of your research.
Yeah, so So I suppose I want to just taking a little bit of a step back. One of the things that Sade's excellent report does is it really is a reflection on where we are now. And also this question about where we want to be. And where we are now is saying it is a right, it is a utility. I don't know if you saw in my feed today, something popped up about a short survey that Virgin Media O2 has done about apparently how, many of us would rather give up booze or not go on a date than lose internet connection. But this point as well, it came through so strongly from the Apple collective members about it being both a right and a utility. It is a necessity. It's a lifeline for people, and it's also life enriching. And we've got a lot of that consensus. We've got consensus around the fact that we need a device and we need the data connectivity and we need the digital skills and confidence and the support when things go wrong. But if I were to ask all of you, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for a household? What is the minimum? Chi, you talked about a tablet being shared among several children. None of us would think that's acceptable. But what then should be an acceptable minimum? And so that really is why this project on the minimum digital living standard is being taken forward. And it's very much a collaborative project. There are people in the room. There's Abby, raise your hand, and Simeon, who are both also co-investigators. What this is doing is it brings together academic experts, so the team at Loughborough, which is where Abby's from, who've developed a very robust deliberative methodology, which has created something called the minimum income standard. Then you've got Simeon and his team, experts on digital inclusion and really understanding that from a citizen's perspective.
I'd love to pick up on just what she was mentioning about how these concepts need to evolve. And if you think, obviously over the last 6 months or so, we've seen all this hype about the metaverse and generative AI, and our whole use of technology is going to change. Do you see the minimum digital living standard evolving significantly in the short term?
Yeah. So two things. First of all, just very quickly following on from what she was saying. Interestingly, one of the skills areas identified within understanding and managing digital risk is about understanding your digital footprint. So I just think that's, so I think what she was articulating there had developed the minimum digital living standard using the methodology that Loughborough University has developed and been using around the minimum income standard, is it means that as long as there is resource to keep on rebasing and reevaluating, that work can be done. And so from that point of view, it isn't, from that point of view, we would all expect not only the goods and services, but also the skills that we need to evolve. I mean, I think the point has been made already about the importance of creative skills. Now, those didn't really come through so much in the minimum digital living standard this time. I wouldn't be surprised if they came through further in a future iteration. And I'd also be really interested to see how far those would have come up if the challenge hadn't been around we need to think what's the minimum acceptable. And I think that's quite relevant, because one of the things that we've been really conscious of, even now when that we refer to things like essential health services and education and access to government public services. But I am so pleased that the minimum digital living standard for households with children includes having a TV subscription to something like Netflix and having a gaming subscription, because those are articulations of the fact that families use these for social, cultural, civic participation, engagement. It's not only, have enough to be able to book a GP appointment. So there's plenty of scope for it to be developed in further.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Audience time again. Would love to hear questions, comments. If there's anything from our online audience that they wish to contribute, that would be brilliant. So we've got in the grey jacket, and then
Thanks. Simeon Yates, University of Liverpool, working on the MDLS with the rest of the team. It's Peter Chase gone, but I think one of the points I would like to make is when we've been putting the minimum digital living standards together, we're looking at what we need to get people digitally included at a household level, etc. The whole point about, algorithmic bias, automating inequality, there's a great book on that. That's an area where government needs to step up and has, in my opinion, in this country failed. The new AI kind of regulations just walks away from anything there. And that, I think, is another area that inequality is going to appear. Digital inequality is going to appear in how we use it, not in how we access it. And it's a bit of a kind of contradictory bind. We do need to get everybody online, get everybody the digital skills they need, but we can't just rely on them to have digital literacy to manage the online harms. Somebody's got to step in and regulate some of the other aspects of online harms. And that's also about inclusion, but it's also about a minimum standard. We have a minimum standard of roads. Roads aren't falling apart and people aren't, they work, we've got to have that for the internet. If we don't, then all we do is we bring people online, we give them opportunities, and the first thing they encounter are potential harms that they can't do anything about. And pushing it onto them, which you hear a lot of around digital literacy, is only one part of the answer. The other part is some kind of regulation or government intervention. Rant over with.
Thank you. We have a microphone over here, and then I think it was this one. Was it first? Andrew's.
Yeah, just a fairly specific question from our online audience. Elliot, who is Digital Welfare Support Officer for Surrey Libraries, says, is there a different way around this? In Zagreb, citing the example of Zagreb, there is public free Wi-Fi throughout the centre of the city, and Elliot suggests broadband not as popular as 3G or 4G. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I just wanted to ask how you think the last 6 months of innovation in generative AI has changed this conversation.
Okay, I'll take the first question. So we know about 123,000 people in the UK do not have access to a decent connection. So I think, sorry, my mind just went blank for a second. Please repeat the question.
we had one question about, are we just getting people online and then exposing them to online harms they might not be able to deal with? We had one question about, is Wi-Fi and broadband what we should be focusing on? Is it about mobile data? And then we had, what about generative AI?
Okay, sorry. There was a song going on in my head. So I think it's definitely both, because, I mean, by show of hands, who amongst us has both mobile data and kind of fixed broadband at home? Most people do. Most people have both. If you're on the road, you need mobile data. And I think Ofcom's kind of universal service obligation talks about having access to 10 megabits per second by any technology. So that also includes mobile data or kind of connectivity. But when you think about rural not spots, digital not spots, where you have pretty much poor connectivity, kind of drops out every second or so. You also have digital not spots within London, which is surprising, but it's there. I think you can't just focus on fixed broadband or just mobile broadband. It's complementary. They're not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. It's both of them. So I think legislation and policy needs to kind of reflect that. There's a role for local authorities to play, I guess, in terms of kind of supporting the rollout of broadband or mobile broadband and kind of getting out of the way of these providers and also seeing what we can get out of them. So there needs to be some sort of symbiotic relationship between kind of the telecoms industry and the people that are actually like giving you the access. So it's neither, it's both.
So I think the Zagreb question is really important and interesting, because I think the key thing there is where you can have public Wi-Fi, how do you ensure that it can also be really safe and really secure? And so that's one of the big challenges around public Wi-Fi. But absolutely being able to access the internet in public places, public spaces, absolute thumbs up. And libraries are a really important internet access point for a lot of people. But I think certainly from our perspective as Good Things Foundation, our experience in the pandemic is that actual personal access, that household access is absolutely essential and vital as well. And so that's why with industry partner support, we've got the National Data Bank, which wouldn't have happened without Virgin Media O2 and then data from O2 and Vodafone 3. And it's why also we do want to support more awareness and understanding around enabling people to get the best deals they can. I think there should be more proactive support in order to enable people to get the best deal that they can. And you know, we know that some people, even the social tariff, not everyone can afford a social tariff. And also a social tariff will not give you what you need as a minimum if that's also about things like your Netflix subscription and your gaming subscription. So where I would go to, so I was at an event earlier in the week, which was being held by the British Irish Council. And that was a real exchange around digital inclusion. And we heard from a digital inclusion transformation advisor from Estonia. And now anyone who knows anything about digital inclusion will know that Estonia has been up there. Yes, they're amazing. They've done great. But honestly, to hear someone in the room talking about the investment that they've made over 20 years in every which way, so it's about mass training and support of people as citizens and all public sector employees so that they can also have that knowledge and provide that support. And it's about really inclusive design. So it's good quality services, essential services. And it is public and private partnership. So this can happen, it has happened. And what it therefore means is that a phrase like digital by default is actually, it becomes digital by default because people are choosing to use it and they're responding to demand from people and people haven't been left behind. And that's what digital by default should mean. It shouldn't mean forced, it shouldn't be mandated, it should mean this is enhancing and enriching and why wouldn't you want to use this? So I would go to Estonia for kind of, and it did make me think, and I mentioned this to Simeon, who was there as well. I wonder what Estonia would make of the minimum digital living standard as we've developed it. Would they look at what we've said is a minimum acceptable and actually go, no, we're way above that already, or some of those things you've identified we wouldn't even think about because actually we've done such a great job of designing accessible, inclusive services that you wouldn't need to have some of that critical knowledge. And I think that speaks, Polly, to your point about kind of generative AI. I am not an expert on generative AI at all, but there's certainly something about the possibility and the potential to be able to leapfrog over certain skills that we might need now that might be able to be kind of more intuitive and valuable. So I'm thinking about the fact that we've got an Alexa and you can download NHS skills on an Alexa. And does that make it easier to do things rather than needing to go on to, say, a phone or a tablet to do certain things? So I think there's something about some of the skills that could change through generative AI and the sorts of products and services that are out there. But it links back to Chi's point as well about almost that makes it even more important that we understand and we have that critical understanding about how this works, about the data that is being taken from us, who that's being shared with, how that's being used. And that is really important because compared to when I joined Good Things Foundation 5 years ago, I think the word that I've heard more during the pandemic and since, which is another barrier for people using the internet, is about trust. And we could get this minimum acceptable, we could get a minimum digital living standard in place. But if fundamentally we haven't done a good enough job of designing inclusive and trustworthy services, then we're still not going to get uptake and use to the level that we might think. And the only other feeling that I have about generative AI is, from my point of view, the risk that the sexy topic of generative AI is just going to crowd out the absolute essentials of looking at this and saying, this is an issue. Yes, we can talk about generative AI, but let's talking about and taking action and getting, policies and strategies in place to deal with not leaving people behind.
Thank you. I think we have about enough time for one or two more questions. Yes. I will pass on my microphone.
Yeah, Rich, thank you again. Just a quick question about, the debate so far has focused on how do we link people to things being provided currently through the private sector? And of course, the private sector has kind of innovated hugely. But what's the scope for public sector to innovate in this? So we have the BBC, which commissions programming and buys programming that's made through the private sector and makes it available to the public as a whole. Now, it feels like we've kind of reached a limit there. We're not imagining what could be done through, the huge and universal power of the state to be able to commission, to be able to make available. And it feels like there's something kind of stunted about the debate in that sense. And I wondered if the panelists had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. One of my recommendations, which isn't probably going to be a popular one, was around renationalization. And I think it comes from the fact that if we call internet access a human right and we say it needs to be available for all, then there are so many other questions that come about. So who would be the provider of choice? Like local authorities are as the duty bearers, or kind of organizations as duty bearers. How do you select like a provider of choice? And I think, personally, not speaking on behalf of my employer, I think the UK definitely has a productivity problem, and we tend to kind of, I'll give an example. So AstraZeneca, the research, everything came from the UK. When it became time to kind of go kind of on the public FTSE 100, they went to America for funding, for venture funding. And I just think we missed the trick when we kind of do all of that hard work and we kind of let them fly off to America for funding. And I think the UK has an innovation stagnation problem. And I definitely agree, we need to think bolder. We need to think about things like perhaps leasing our ducts as a local authority, leasing our ducts and getting providers to come in and actually we own the ducts and we kind of have more of a say. We could have things like, I know Camden are doing a pilot at the moment around providing free connectivity to estates and looking at the educational projects that I definitely believe we should be investing in. However, money, we have none. And it's just, we just get in that loop of, okay, this would be great, but where's the funding going to come from? Where as a local authority, you're under budgetary constraints, you're having to do more with less, there's like less resources. So I think we definitely have to go back to Emma's point around, if you cannot fix the plumbing, if you cannot get the basics right, then how on earth are you going to get the really exciting, sexy stuff, the semiconductors, the AI? How will you get that right?
Last reflections, Emma, before we wrap up?
I think I just want to say thank you to Jangala, because actually you're a great example of innovation. And so I think there is something about how can we get, and this is part of what the Data Poverty Lab as well is wanting to do here, how can we think more innovatively and more creatively about longer term sustainable solutions to the things that we have been talking about today, and have that being something brilliant and fabulous to aim for, so that the innovators don't only migrate into the worlds of, say, generative AI.
Thank you both so much. And yeah, just to say, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here. I think you've both made not only a really compelling case that we should do something about digital inclusion, but also really set out really clear ways that government, local authorities, local communities could be making improvements. And I think for me, the kind of key takeaway is how holistic an approach we need to be taking, and not just thinking of digital inclusion as something that sits sort of over in a corner, but relates to privacy and safety and security and innovation and AI and all of these issues that we hear so much about, and that we will be discussing over the coming year at the Good Web Network. So really excited to be holding future conversations on those. And if you could just all join me in thanking our speakers and then stay around for a drink. Thank you.